And the whole idea that the word God actually in Hebrew is used in 2 different ways during that story. And could you just talk a little about that?
Sure.
The impact it has on the meaning of the story.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it quick. The story of Abraham and Isaac is a really important one, and it kind of could be an argument for people that are like, so you don't think that there's a transactional thing between God and humanity? Let me tell you the story of Abraham and Isaac. And if you know that story in a certain way, it is Abraham gets called by God, and then before Abraham gets anything good, he gets a promise. And then once that promise is delivered in his son, Isaac, then God says to Abraham, sacrifice your son to me. Right? Give it up. Woman at the temple. Any of these things. Live in a sacrificial if-then system. If you sacrifice, then I'll bless you. Right? It's easy to hear the story that way. And then the story ends, right? Abraham has the knife up, and then God calls it off and says, psych, sorry, just wanted to make sure you would do it, because it would be better to have you still with one in the chamber than to actually do it. I just want to make sure you would kill your son, even though you didn't actually do it. And it's a super confusing story about either a psychotic God or this negotiation going on. I think it's actually not a story about would Abraham sacrifice Isaac. I think it's actually a story, would Abraham go through with not sacrificing Isaac? And here's how. In that story, there's 2 names used, one used for God, Elohim, which means gods, multiple gods, and one word called Yahweh, which is translated the Lord. So if you're reading the story, you'll read sometimes, and God said, and other times, and the Lord said. Now, I think that matters. So I tell this little story about when you see the calling of Abraham, he gets called out of the land of the Canaanites. And the Canaanites, in that land, they had multiple gods who went under the name Elohim, gods. So in the story, you have Yahweh, the Lord, calling Abraham. So if you were the director of this play, you would have to decide, do you have the same voiceover artist be the role of Yahweh and Elohim, or 2 different voices? I think you're supposed to hear it as 2 different voices. So if you're reading the story, what you hear is Abraham lives in the land of the Canaanites with Elohim as the God who requires sacrifice. Then Yahweh says, come out of that land into the promised land I'm going to show you, where you're going to become the father of many nations. It's Yahweh, the Lord, that gives the promise to Abraham. It's Yahweh that brings the baby into Sarah. It's Yahweh that says, just hold on a minute, and Abraham doesn't, and works out another deal, but it's Yahweh that delivers this. And then, guess what? It is Elohim who says, sacrifice your child. And then it is, you guess it, Yahweh who calls it off. So this is a story of, would Abraham leave behind, you have heard it said in your childhood, God requires sacrifice for, God does not require sacrifice from Yahweh. Could he flip and listen to that story? The reason that Abraham is the father of the faith is that he was able to say, I've heard it said, but there's another story to live in. It's the story of the first calling of a nation to leave behind the old God for the story of the new God. So the temptation, the testing of Abraham isn't would he do it, it's would he listen to the new call and leave behind the old story. Now that starts to sound familiar to all of us. That's how Abraham becomes the father of the life that we're all living, because we all feel those same temptations, right? Could we leave behind the stories we have in our head? Not only our religious stories, also the stories we tell ourselves. We all tell ourselves all kinds of stories, and we get all wrapped up in it.